slow down, to stop, and make room in our thoughts for God. So that encourages me, because oftentimes other things can crowd out God from our thoughts and minds. So, well, welcome. Glad you're here. If you're new here, we'd give you extra welcome. Glad you're here. There's a little green card in the seat back in front of you, and if you would be so kind as to take that and fill it out and drop it in the green box back by the doors on your way out, that'd be wonderful. Let us know that you're here. And that same green box is a place that contributions can be left by regular attenders. There is a children's wiggle room if you've got kids in here that need a little more room to move and make a little more noise. There's a room in the children's area that you can take them to and lock them in. No, not lock them in. That you can go and stay with them in there. We support Apple Crisis Pregnancy Center. They've been serving here in the Eau Claire area for over 40 years, and they carry out a very comprehensive support ministry to folks with unplanned pregnancies. And so one of their fundraisers is the baby bottle fundraiser. There's a table in the foyer if you want to check that out. It's going on for a couple more weeks now. So check that out. We'd really encourage you to consider that. There's a craft day coming up Saturday, February 18th. That's next Saturday, 6 days from now. From 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And if you have questions, you can talk to Deb Wells right over there. And as we spoke last week, there's a team going down to the Dominican Republic. They're going to build a house for a woman there. There's 5 going, and they're leaving on what, Paul, the 18th? Leaving on the 18th. So please keep them in prayer. They'll be traveling and jumping into the work down there. So they'll be down there from the 18th until following Sunday. So back then. So keep them in prayer. And we did announce last week that there's some monies needed to fund the building itself, the home for this woman. And it's nearly all of that $6,000 has been received. If you're interested in making a contribution to that, you can put it in the box or talk to Jim Myers about that. So, with that, I'm calling Rob up here, and I'll stop talking and he can begin.
Sometimes we have to lock Mark in a room when he's too squirrely. Not often. He's pretty good. Well, welcome again. I agree with Mark. It's good to be together. Really good to be together to spend some time. I like that verse. You know, we find no room for God, and we've done it. Today you found room for God. You're here, and everything else is somewhere else, and we're going to spend the next few minutes just looking at God's Word, listening to God, and that's a good thing. So well done, everyone. We are into Genesis again. We're picking back up with our Genesis series. We've been chewing through that here for almost a year. When did we start that? I forget. It was maybe April, March, something like that. So we're closing in on a year's worth of going through Genesis, going through it very slowly. We'll take a break. We're picking it up today again. But just a reminder, if you have, Sue's waving at me. April 24th is when we started. Okay, so not quite a year. We're closing in on it. But if you want to, we do have study guides that follow the message today. They're in that table in the back. If you wanted to get up and go get one right now, that's fine. Go right ahead and do it. We also have binders over there that you can get and keep these because as we go through Genesis, it can be easy to kind of forget what we're about, and so it's good to be able to look back. So we are up to Genesis chapter 16 today. We're going to begin chapter 16. And this passage, we've been looking at Abram. Abram is a main character in the book of Genesis, and we've been now looking at his life. He was introduced a couple of chapters ago, and now we're seeing how Abram's life unfolds. And again, the point of Genesis is God wants us to understand things. He wants us to understand the world around us. He wants us to understand ourselves, and He wants us to understand Him. And then He wants us to understand how all of those things work together. As we understand God, as we understand ourselves, as we understand the world we live in, God's desire is that we would then be able to put that together and know how we interact with each other, how we interact with Him. And so we've been seeing Abram now as God begins to unfold this plan to deal with what we saw back in Genesis chapter 2, the fall of man, how we as people sinned against God, and that changed the world we live in. God now has a plan to redeem us, to change that situation. Abram is a big part of that, and so we've been looking at Abram. And today we're continuing with Abram. Sarai is his wife, but today there's a new character being introduced into the story, and that's Hagar. And so we're going to look at the story here of Abram as now a new character gets introduced into Abram's story. And just very quickly to catch us up a little bit, as we've looked at Abram's life, we've seen that God has been making promises to Abram. At the very beginning, when we first saw Abram, God made a promise to Abram. He said, Abram, I'm going to bless you. Follow me, and I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your life, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So there was this promise from God to Abram that Abram heard. He understood it. God said to Abram, follow me, I'm going to bless you. A little later, Abram had followed God from where he lived in the east, and he'd wandered, and God had taken him to the land of Canaan, which we know now as modern-day Israel or Palestine. And God had said to Abram, okay, look around, and He gave him another promise. He said, I'm going to give you this land. All of the land you see, walk around in it. This is going to be yours. I'm going to give it to you. So that was the second time that God specifically came to Abram and made a promise to him. The last time we looked at Abram and saw Abram, we saw a third promise that God had made to him. And the promise that God made to him is your descendants, Abram, from your own body, your offspring, are going to be a lot. If you could count the sands of the sea, then you can count your offspring, said God. And it's going to be from your body. Your own progeny are going to multiply, and there's just going to be lots and lots of descendants. Because Abraham had been getting older, and he was wondering, well, gosh, I don't have any kids, and maybe my servant's going to get my stuff. And God said, no, I'm going to make you a promise, Abram. You're going to have children, and they're going to multiply. There's going to be a lot of them. So we've seen these promises, and we've seen Abram figuring that out. How do I live my life in light of the fact that God is making these promises to me? Sometimes he does really well, sometimes not so much. But we've been seeing Abram kind of as his life plays out in the context of God making these promises to him. And so that's where we're at today as we begin chapter 16. So, and again, we see now that this new character being introduced. And so we're going to walk through this. We're only going to look at 6 verses today, 1 through 6. And we're just going to take it in chunks here. And we'll start with just the first couple of verses. And as I think about this, Abram and Sarai are at a point in their life where they're kind of stepping back and assessing their life, assessing their situation. Again, in light of the promises that God has made them, they've been learning how to live in light of God's promises. And so here in chapter 16, they're beginning to assess their situation. I'll just read the first couple verses. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai had said. So Abram and Sarai are in this situation where they said, okay, we've been following God for some number of years. God's made all these promises to us. One of the promises is that our children, our descendants are going to inherit this land. And through our descendants, God is going to bless all the families of the earth. All these things are happening. That's phenomenal, except we don't have any kids. And they're getting older. At this point in their lives, Abram is 85. He's pretty old. I just turned 60, and I thought, man, I'm getting really old. He's 85. 85 years old. Sarai is 76. So they're both well along in years. My apologies. I mean, they're past the time when you would think, okay, we're going to let's make a family. Those days are in the past for them. At least it makes sense to them that those days are in the past, and it certainly makes sense to us because again, they're trying to live their life in light of the promises that God has made to them. And one of them, a big one, is your descendants are going to inherit the land. Your descendants are going to, through them, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth. So all of these promises that God has made to them depend on them having children, and they don't have any. So they're looking at their life and taking a step back and saying, okay, we've been trying to live our life according to God's promises, but it doesn't look like it's working. Or at least it's confusing, I would think. It's confusing to them. And so Sarai responds to that. And we've all been in this situation, I assume, I certainly have, where you expect something to happen. You've kind of been going along expecting a certain thing to happen, and it doesn't happen, or it's different than you thought. And at some point you stop and say, well, wait a minute. This is not turning out as I anticipated it was going to. I thought something different was going to happen, and it hasn't happened, and now I need to know what to do about it. And I think that's where Sarai, at least, is, because she takes some steps. But she does it, and we see here, I think, kind of what her mindset is. And she says two things that are interesting. She said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." She says two things there. She says, the Lord has kept something from me, but I can build. The Lord kept something from me. He's not doing something, so I will. God's not doing this thing that I thought he was going to do. God's not doing this thing that he even said he was going to do. It's not happening. The Lord has kept it from happening, and she even attributes it to the Lord. This is, God's just not doing it. Her response to that is, well, I can do it. I will do it instead. And in some ways it makes sense. I think. Okay, maybe, God's plan isn't happening here. Well, maybe I need to do something. And certainly there are times when that's true. There are certainly times when God says, I'm going to make a promise. Here's what I'm going to do. And so as part of that, I want you to do this. That kind of thing happens all the time. You do this, says God, and then I'll do that. We haven't seen that here, but Sarai kind of puts herself into that position. Well, maybe to make God's promise happen, there's something I have to do about it. And it's just an interesting thought there. And I don't know because I wasn't there. I don't know Sarai, but I wonder if she began to be confused, perhaps. I thought this thing was going to happen. It didn't happen. And now it looks like it's impossible for it's going to happen. And that confusion may have led her to discontent. I've certainly been there. To think, to expect something, when we expect something is going to happen and then it doesn't happen, it brings up a feeling of discontent, or it can. Particularly when someone we trust promises that it's going to happen and then it doesn't. That can rub us the wrong way. I wonder if Sarah kind of looks at this and thinks, well, dang it. God just didn't do what he was supposed to do, but I don't want to blame God, so maybe I just got to do something. There's a discontent there, perhaps even a desperation. I think we get to points in our life where we want something so badly. We've been waiting for something so long. We've been expecting something and planning for something and basing so much of how we view ourselves and what our life is going to be like on this thing happening that when it doesn't happen, it can be desperate. It's like the death of a dream. When our dreams die, that can put us in a very desperate place. And I wonder if Sarai here has gotten to that place. I don't know, but I wonder. She's 75 years old. She's left home. Her husband led her away from her family years ago. They've been wandering around, living, kind of on the move. But she's always had this thought, God has promised us this thing, but now she's getting later and later in life. It hasn't happened. I don't know, but I certainly see some discontent. I wonder if she just began to get desperate. For sure, we see she feels as though maybe I need to do something to make God's promise happen. He's kept this from happening, but I can build a family. So that's what she does. Let's do this. Now, Abram, it's interesting here what Abram's thought process is in this, because Abram has heard all these promises God has made, particularly the one about having kids. In fact, in the chapter right before this, where we see God make that promise, God and Abram had been having a conversation about the fact that Abram didn't have any descendants. And Abram said to God, I don't have any kids, and this servant in my house is going to inherit everything I have. So this exact topic had come up between Abram and God. And God had said to Abram in verse 4 of chapter 15, then the word of the Lord came to Abram, this man, this servant, will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And it's interesting, it says then in verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Abram saw the same situation that Sarai saw. Okay, God, you're making this promise. You made this promise to me, but it just doesn't look like it's working because I don't have any heirs and I'm an old man. But God said, no. Out of your own body, you are going to have a son. Out of your own body, a son is going to come, and from him then, these offspring are going to be greater than the stars. And Abram, it says, believed the promise. Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. In fact, if you look in the New Testament, when it talks about Abram, this exact passage comes up a lot. One of the shining moments in Abram's life, where God made him a promise that looked to Abram to be impossible, but Abram said, I believe you. And God said, good, well done. You believed me. And then nothing happened. Abram believed, and nothing happened. And so Abram now, some time later, after God made that promise to him, when his wife comes to him and she's discontent and says, you know what, God made this promise, but we're not seeing it happen. And Abram says, yes, I remember the promise. I believe it. God's going to do it. And she says, well, maybe we need to help. Maybe there's something we have to do. And so here's a plan, Abram, to make God's promise work. And Abram, and again, we don't know what all was going on in his mind, but he went along with it. He said, okay, let's do that. And he might have thought, if you look at the promise in chapter 15, it's interesting. God does not say from Sarai, you're going to have these kids. He says, from your body, Abram, your son. Doesn't mention Sarai there. And so Abram could have perhaps thought, okay, well, all right, maybe I'm going to have kids, but you're not. I don't know, but that at least is plausible. You can think, well, but maybe that's why Abram thought, you know what, Sarai is presenting another plan. Okay, that makes sense. That makes some sense. One thing that you don't see anybody doing here, what's the one character that's missing from this little interaction so far? God. He's been the one making the promises all along. He's spoken to Abram, and now Abram and Sarai are talking about it, which is good, but nobody ever thought to go ask God. They just thought, we need a new plan. We need a new plan. So they made a new plan, and they carried it out. Back to chapter 16. Sarai said, "Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So, after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. So that's their new plan. That's Abram and Sarai's new plan. Sarai can't have kids. Now, it's interesting here why they thought Abram still could. He's 85, but they thought, we got to try something. So I'm going to give you my servant. Sarai took her servant, gave her to Abram as his wife. Now, this was not an uncommon practice at that time and place in the world for men to have more than one wife. You see it in the Bible often, and you even see this kind of exact thing. In fact, Abram's grandson, Jacob, is going to be in a very similar situation here in a couple of generations. It wasn't a completely uncommon thing to do. What would happen is there would be perhaps a principal wife, in this case Sarai, but then the husband, Abram, might have other secondary wives, and then and the family would grow through these many wives, but Sarai would be the principal wife. That's maybe why she thought to herself, I can build a family, so even if sons are born to my husband Abram through this other woman, I'm still kind of the principal matriarch of the family, so I can kind of see it as my family. Perhaps that's what she was thinking, because this was not an uncommon practice at that time and place in the world. However, it was never God's plan. There's all kinds of things that happen in the world. There's all kinds of things that we see in the Bible that God may or may not say, okay, you can't do this, but that he does say this is not a good idea. I think this is one of those things. God's plan had always been way back from the beginning. Remember, we said Genesis is all about helping us to understand kind of how we fit in the world, how we interact with each other, with God, with our surroundings. And at the very beginning, God said what? He took a man. That for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This idea of a husband and a wife together, the two of them as a unit, was God's plan for family all along. Now, people had been adding to that and working through that in all kinds of ways throughout the generations. This was one of them. We never see God saying, no, you cannot do that, but we definitely see this was not God's plan. And the other thing we see is when people tried to do something like this, when married couples concocted and executed a plan like this, it was always problematic. It never worked out well. And time after time after time in the Bible, we see that's just not a good idea. It got David into all kinds of trouble. It ruined Solomon. We're going to see Jacob it's going to go sideways for Jacob, Abram's grandson. Again and again and again and again, when we see people try to kind of modify God's plan to think we can make this a little better. God's plan is pretty good, but I'll bet you if we tinker with it, we can make it even better. It never works, and that's the case here. So Abram and Sarai's new plan, they thought about it, they did it. Here, Abram, here's my maidservant, take her as your wife. And it looked like it was working, right? Hagar got pregnant. By golly, this is working. And then the whole thing fell apart. And when the plan falls apart here, we see everybody reacting to that. And I'll finish out the passage here with the second half of verse 4. Or I'll just start with verse 4. He, Abram, slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Hey, that's what we wanted all along. That's what the whole point of this plan was. When she, Hagar, knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Okay. God had made a promise. It didn't seem like it was working. It looked like it was impossible. Sarai at least decided that we have to do something to try to make this happen. She proposed a plan. Abram went along with it. Hagar, the maidservant, became Abram's wife. She got pregnant. The plan worked the way it was supposed to work, and then everybody went south. Everybody began to respond when their plan did what they hoped their plan would do. It was dissatisfying to everybody. So let's look at these different characters and see how they responded. First, Hagar. When she got pregnant, and by the way, this is she perhaps gets lost in the shuffle here. This is an incredibly difficult situation for her. We don't know. She's from Egypt. They call her a maidservant. She was probably a slave. I don't know how it had happened, but she had been taken somehow or was a servant in this house, possibly a slave in the house. She wasn't asked, do you want to become Abram's wife? Sarai gave her to Abram. She's kind of a pawn in all of this, it seems as though. On the other hand, her circumstance, at least socially, at least financially, changed for the better. I went from being a servant to a wife, even if it's a secondary wife, and now I'm pregnant, and that's good, and all this stuff is happening. But it says that she, when she discovered she was pregnant, began to despise Sarai. And I guess I can understand that. Again, I don't know that pretty sure that's not a good thing. But, put yourself in her position, and she's been kind of told what she's going to do and what she's not going to do, whether she's going to marry or not marry, who she's going to marry, all this stuff. And now all of this has happened, and she is now in a position where she's going to have the son or the child of the patriarch of this whole thing here. And her mistress, who maybe, kind of was trying to use Hagar for her own benefit, Hagar begins to despise Sarai. While you can understand it, it's not helpful. It's hard. I can't imagine the dynamic between a husband and two wives. I can't imagine that dynamic. It has to be worse if the wives hate each other. But that's what we see happening here. And while you can maybe understand it, it's not good. It's not good. And Hagar begins to despise Sarai. Sarai kind of comes unglued here. At least I'm putting my understanding on. Again, I wasn't there, but what little we see here, she seems to go kind of ballistic. And she resents Hagar, which you can understand. Who are you to despise me? You're wife number 2. I'm supposed to be the one in charge here, and you're looking down on me. That ain't right. So she resents Hagar, and she blames Abram. You are responsible for the wrong done to me. This is your fault. It was her plan. This was her idea. But this is not going right. This is not working. The things that Sarai hoped were going to happen, I can only assume are not happening at all. I wanted to build a family, but this is not working. This was a terrible plan, Abram. Yeah, knucklehead, you did this to me. I gave my servant into your arms, and look what's happening, and this is your fault. And it's so interesting here. She feels justified before God. I call God to account. May God judge between you and me. I think we're seeing some of the desperation in Sarai's life, honestly. I think she had longed so much for this promise to happen. It wasn't happening. She stepped in, tried to make it happen, and now it's getting worse, and I think Sarai is melting down. I don't know that for sure, but I think so. This is getting worse. Not only did my expectation and dream die, but now I'm in a worse situation than I was before. It would have been better had I just left this alone and never had any kids, because this is infinitely worse. Now my husband has another woman that he may be looking at with more favor than me, because she's the one that God's going to use to make all these promises happen. And what in the world just happened? I know I'm projecting onto Sarai, but I at least see some desperation here. Abram is strangely passive in all of this. Strangely passive. And on one hand, I can feel for Abram. I really can, as a husband. And I'm sure, wives, you can look at this and feel for Sarah. I really can, because everybody's got their things here. But as a husband, I'm sure Abram is saying, what? This was your idea. Why are you mad at me? I just did what you asked me to do, and now you're calling God to judge me because of it. What did I do? I tell Sue, men and women are this wonderful thing that I've been married for 35 years almost, and I told Sue today, I love you so much, but I just don't understand you a lot of the time. Those exact words came out of my mouth. And she said, yep, I love you and I don't get you either. I tell Sue, and I don't think she gets it, but I say to her, men oftentimes know they're in trouble, but they have no idea why. I know I did something really stupid. I have no idea what it was. I know I'm in trouble, I don't know why. And I suspect that Abram feels that here. I suspect. What did I do? You're blaming me, and you're calling down God to judge me, and all I did was go along with your plan. But I think that's the problem. I really think that's the problem. I think Abram is trying to wash his hands of this. Abram is trying to wash his hands. He's not going to take any responsibility for this plan either. Nobody's going to take any responsibility for this dumpster fire that is happening. And Abram, I think, is recognizing, okay, this was a bad idea, and I probably should have said something a year ago. When my wife proposed this plan, for whatever reason, Abram didn't. But I think Abram is just as to blame as anybody here, because he is strangely passive. He was passive at the beginning, and now, when things are going bad, it's like he's saying, well, okay, whatever, this is not mine. I have nothing to do with this. I have nothing to do with this. You do with your servant as you want. Well, think about this. If Abram had thought at the beginning, okay, this is God's fulfillment. This is the way God's going to fulfill his promise to me of descendants. Sarai's not having kids. He never said specifically it was Sarai. So here now I have another wife. She has a kid. Aha! God is fulfilling his promise. And yet the first chance Abram gets is he says, oh, go away. I don't want this. It's very odd to me, Abram's response in all of this. And perhaps you can see it more clearly. But to me, Abram's response is weirdly, strangely passive. And I think he's just trying to distance himself. This is going south, and I'm just going to try to, I don't want to step on a landmine. I do not want to get in the middle of this. Okay, whatever. You girls figure it out. I'm going to go with the sheep or something. But that's extremely unhelpful. I see vestiges of Adam and Eve here, perhaps. You remember back when we looked in Genesis at the story of Adam and Eve? Eve took the apple. The implication seems to be that Adam was right there, watched her take it and eat it. Why didn't he intervene? And then she offered some to him. He knew God had said don't eat it, but he took it and ate it. And then later on, he tried to say, well, it wasn't my fault. I didn't have anything to do with it. And God said, yes, you did. I think Abram here is acting kind of like Adam did, perhaps. While you can understand it, just like you can understand Hagar's response, just like you can understand Sarai's response, you cannot excuse it. Abram needed to, a year ago, do something. Now that the plan is going south, he needs to step up and take responsibility and say, okay, this is a mess, but let's figure it out. He does none of that. He washes his hands, seems to walk away. Hagar then does the one sensible thing that anyone's done in this passage, and she runs away. I'm getting out of this mess. This is a freaking mess. So she runs away. Next week, Justin's going to pick up the story from there because we're going to see an amazing thing how God interacts with Hagar. We're going to see some redemption and some amazing love and an incredible story of how Hagar's life is seen by God, cared for by God, blessed by God. But today, we just see here, this is complete. It went from bad to worse, and I'm leaving. So that's our story here today. So, what do we learn from it? What can you and I take away from this story? Again, because the whole point of this, guys, is not just to read the story. It's to learn. It's to learn, how do I understand God? How do I understand myself? How do I understand you? How do I interact well with you and God? And so what can you and I learn from this story as we see Hagar and Abram and Sarai interacting? Well, I'll offer this. And there are different lessons, and you may learn a different lesson from this. And the great thing about God is that as you read this story, and I would encourage you to read it, go home, read it, think about it, because God will speak to you just like he spoke to Abraham. Just like he spoke to people all throughout history. God says, I want to speak to you. And God will talk to you and tell you things specifically for you. But I will offer this as a lesson that we can take away from this. And that's this. It's very easy for us, and I think we all do, try to get ahead of God. We try to get ahead of God. Here's what I mean by that. There are many times, for all of us as Christians, when we believe promises that God has made to us. We talk about that here a lot, how God speaks to us. God, through the Bible, through his Holy Spirit, he makes promises to us as he did to Abram. And we can know what those promises are, and we can even believe them. We can think, okay, that's wonderful, God. We can hear that promise from God, and we can, just like Abram, say, I believe that. That's a wonderful thing. And we can begin to live our life in expectation that that promise is going to happen. That's very, very good. But oftentimes those promises are delayed, or they come about in ways that we don't expect, or when they are fulfilled, they look different than we thought they were going to look. That also happens, I think, to all of us. It certainly happened to Abram and Sarai. God made a promise. Abram believed it, but it was being delayed. It was happening in a different way. It wasn't what he expected, and it's very easy for us, just like them, when we're waiting for God's promises, when we're looking for God's promise to happen, when we are living our life in anticipation of and expectation of those promises being fulfilled, it's easy for us to get discontent, desperate, and confused. Why isn't this happening, God? I thought that this would have happened by now. I thought it would have happened in a certain way. I was really sure that it was going to happen at this time in this circumstance, and it didn't. That's confusing. It can be disconcerting. And as it goes longer and longer and longer, as the promise is delayed perhaps more, as the promise begins to play itself out in ways we never anticipated, sometimes in ways that we wouldn't choose, it can make us begin to think like, what am I missing? We can begin to be desperate. Unmet expectations are a difficult, extremely hard thing for us to live with. If you're going to believe God's promises, oftentimes, just like Abram and Sarai, we are faced with well, wait a minute. My expectations about this are not being met. I have to deal with that. So, like Abram and Sarai, we can take matters into our own hands without asking God. Okay, God, you said this was going to happen. I used to see this a lot with young people. I felt it as a young person wanting desperately to get married, longing to have that person that you could become one with. Believing, I remember me and Mark Halverson roomed together for several years back when we were in college, and we would tell ourselves, someday we're going to be, it's college kids, okay, two young college men. We just wanted to be married, and we would tell ourselves, someday we'll be happy fathers with pregnant wives. And they're like, yes, that's exciting. Because we expected that to happen. Each of us expected it to happen sooner and at different times with different people. And it's hard, I think. That's one way. But there are all kinds of ways like that happen, that can happen. When you have children, you expect their lives to turn out in a certain way. And you claim promises from God about your kids that you feel God has spoken to you about your kids, and then their life begins to unfold and it is not what you expected. And so we can begin to take matters into our own hands. I have to make this right. God promised me a wife. I don't have one. I'm going to go get one. God promised me that my kids were going to be a certain way. They're not doing that. I got to force them into what they need to do. God promised whatever it is, it's not happening. I have to make this happen. The Lord has prevented this from happening the way I thought it was going to, but I can fix it. God hasn't done it. I can fix it. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to make this be. I'm going to help, God. All I'm doing is helping. I'm going to make sure that your promise happens. You just sit back. I'll take care of this. We take matters into our own hands, but we don't ask God. We tell God, I'm going to take care of this. How many times are your prayers not asking God, but telling God? Sometimes that's okay. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes we just tell God what we're thinking. We tell God what's going on. There's all kinds of times in our prayers that we just tell God things. Sometimes, though, what we need to do, especially in circumstances like this, is to ask God, what should I do? What am I missing? Maybe I'm not missing anything. Maybe I shouldn't do anything. I just need to sit and wait. Tell me what to do. But instead, when we become confused or discontent or desperate, it's very easy for us to change that from what should I do to here's what I'm going to do, God. And our prayers become just progress reports to God. Okay, God, you promised me this, and I'm making it happen, and I'm going to do this, okay? Bless that, okay? Now I'm going to do this. Make that work, or something like that. Oftentimes, God wants us to do something. There are many times when the fulfillment of God's promise hinges on or goes through things that God asks us to do. The trick is to know, okay, is there something I'm supposed to do here, or am I supposed to just sit and wait? The only way you're going to know that is to ask. Ask. Call to me, says God. Here's a promise. And I will answer you. Call to me, and I will answer you. If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously without reproach, and it will be given to him or her. I think it's okay. Well, I think it's natural to be discontent, confused, disconcerted. The trick is, okay, I can take matters into my own hands, or I can ask you. But we get ahead of God and we can think like Sarai and Abram, I'm just going to fix this. When that happens, we wander into bad places. It's like Abram and Sarai. Abram allowed his family to go into a very bad place. Sarai led her family right there. She built the road signs, loaded everybody into the cart, and drove them to a bad place. Abram stood around and watched it happen. We can do that, I think. When we decide to take matters into our own hands, we will almost always wander into bad places. And here's why. We can never do it as well as God. We can never make the plan work as well as God can, ever. We cannot. He can do things we can't do. He understands things we don't understand. The plan is usually better than we ever thought. We just have to realize that if God makes a promise, He has the ability and the desire to make it happen. And He can do it better than we can. There are so many things I know I can't do. I have a chainsaw at home that I can't fix. No matter how hard I try, I can't. You know who can? Some of you men in here know who can. Say it. Dwayne Schindler can fix anything in the world, be it a 12-ton bulldozer or your tweezers. He can make them both work better than they ever did before. When my chainsaw doesn't work, I have two options. I can take it apart and it'll never work again. Or I say, hey, Dwayne, can you fix my chainsaw? You bet. So I did that. I've learned over the years. I took my chainsaw to Dwayne. He called me and said, hey, I got it working. Works great. He probably polished every screw and every bolt, and it's just this beautiful thing now, and it works great. God can do better than you can do. We have to be willing to recognize, God, the promises that you make. There are times when you want me to step in and help, but ultimately, this is going to work, and it's going to be wonderful if I let you do it. If I let you do it, God. Not me. I will not take matters into my own hands. So here's a question. Two questions. I'm going to jump ahead, fellas, to the last slide there. Two questions that I will propose to us today. As we look at this story and try to let God speak to us in it, I will propose two questions for you to think about, and here they are. What promises are you waiting on? Do you have promises from God? I would hope that you do, because I think that's kind of not the only way God interacts with us, but I do think that's one of the ways God interacts with us. He says, look, I'm going to do this in the future. And I want you to look ahead. Anticipation and waiting and patience and working slowly towards something is part of God's training for us in so many ways. We live in an instant society where everything is right now. God does not, He can, and sometimes He does. Sometimes it's instant. He can make things happen instantly. So often God says, no, I'm going to wait. And in that waiting, there's a reason for it. There are things I'm going to do with you. Do you have things that God has said, this is going to happen? It is going to happen sometime. What are the promises that you have from God that you're waiting on? I'm not going to say, if you don't have a promise from God, I don't know what that means. I would just encourage you to do this. Go to God and say, Lord, are there things that you have told me that I'm expecting? Because it changes how you live your life. You want to live as a Christian, one of the things I think that helps is to know that God has something for me in the future. It's not right now. It's in the future. I believe that God's going to do it. I believe that it's good. So now I'm going to live my life in anticipation of that. That changes how I live my life now, doesn't it? Knowing there's something in the future that we're looking forward to, expecting, it changes how we live our life now. I think that's one of the reasons God gives us promises. This thing is going to happen in the future, so I want you to know it, believe it, and live now as if it's real, because it directs our attention to Him, changes our expectations of life. Do you have promises that you feel God has given you? What are they? Things that are going to happen in the future. God said this is going to happen in the future. That's the first question. What are the promises you're waiting on? And here's the second one. Are you content to wait? Are you content to wait? there is something so wonderful about sitting. And when you feel discontent, I longed for a wife, and it wasn't happening. The woman that I really felt like God said, many of you have heard this story, but this woman that I felt, I'd asked God, I'd specifically asked Him, and I'd been growing, and I'd been trying to follow God, and I'd been trying to obey God, and I asked Him, what about this girl? I thought He said to me, that's the one you're going to marry. That's the one, Rob. So I told her that. And she said, no, I'm not. And that was crushing to me, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I still believed, well, God, you want me to marry someone, but it's certainly not happening, and I tried, and I blew it. So I would say I'm going to have to wait. And it was hard to wait, and it was sad to wait. It was sad for me to see that girl and feel like that's the one I want to marry, and I can't. But when I felt that sadness, when I felt that desperation, when I felt that discontent, when I felt that confusion, I'm so grateful that I developed this habit. Whenever I would feel that, I would take it and I would sit down with God and I would talk to Him about it. This is really sad. This is really confusing. I don't know what to do with this. But I wouldn't just do it by myself somewhere or try to make something happen. I would just go, because I tried to fix the plan and that didn't work at all. So now, God, I'm just going to sit in my discontent. What it did, what that full year of discontent did, is it drove me closer and deeper into the arms of God. I would not surrender that. I would not trade that. I would not. That was better than having that girl say yes. It really, truly, in all honesty, I mean that with all of my heart. It was better than having that girl say yes, because I sat and I drew closer to God. I felt His heart more. I felt His arms around me more. I felt His love more when I wasn't feeling it from someone else. Are you willing, are you content to wait? Not necessarily content with the circumstance. I wasn't content with the circumstance, but I chose to be content sitting next to God and just saying, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll sit here with you. That girl came to her senses and married me, by the way. So, are you content to wait? Abram and Sarai had a promise from God. It wasn't happening. They were rightly, understandably looking at it and thinking, this ain't working. Abram was 86, 85. Sarai was 76. This ain't working. We got to fix this plan. So they took it into their own hands, and it went horribly south. Horribly south. We're going to see how, as this story goes on, how God takes the messes we create and He fixes them for us. He loves us anyhow. But today that's our lesson. What promises are you waiting on? And are you content to wait? Father, I pray that we would have promises from You. I pray, God, that each of us would be hearing Your voice. Not just promises, You do so much more than that, but it is good for us to be waiting and expecting You to do something. It's like a child has expectations of their parents, promises that their parents have made them. It's good for us to live that way. I just pray that we would know what the promises are You've given each one of us, and then help us, Lord, to be content to wait. And when it gets confusing, which it will, when it turns out differently than we thought and we become discontent, which we will, I pray that we would just go to You. Not try to fix it, but go and talk to You. Draw closer to You in the midst of it, Lord. Help us each to do that, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to take a 3-minute break. 3 minutes. Come on back. We will worship the Lord.